The Oak Haven diner sat at the dead end of Mill Creek Road like a stubborn coal ember, refusing to go cold. 9 tables, a counter with 7 stools, the kind of place where the coffee was bad and nobody cared because the company was good. At 9:47 on a Tuesday night in November, the windows had fogged over from the warmth inside, and the rain outside came sideways off the Cascades in cold, needling sheets. Ruth Miller was 66 days into her first winter without Harold. She moved behind the counter the way she always had. Deliberate, unhurried refilling Hank Pruitt's decaf without being asked, nodding at the Delacroix sisters, who sat in the corner booth sharing a single slice of apple pie the way they had every Tuesday since 1987. The diner was hers and Harold's, and now it was just hers, and she kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant the grief hit like a truck. The bell above the door screamed. Clayton Briggs didn't walk into rooms. He occupied them. 6'2", 240 pounds of fourth-generation timber money. His Carhartt jacket was clean. The man had people to do his dirty work, but his boots were caked thick with black mud from the county plots east of Oak Haven Lake. That mud had a smell to it. Sharp wrong, like something chemical hiding inside something organic. He pulled out the stool at the end of the counter and sat down without being invited. Ruth. Not a greeting. A summons. She set the coffee pot down on the warmer. "We're about to close, Clayton." He slid a manila envelope across the laminate. "Sign this tonight and you don't have to open tomorrow." She didn't touch it. He'd been at this for 4 months. Ever since Harold died, Clayton had been circling the Miller property on Crooked Creek, 42 acres of high-ground timber that backed up against the lake's east shore. The last private parcel standing between Briggs Industrial and full control of the watershed. "That land is not for sale," Ruth said. Her voice was quiet and absolutely steady. The same voice she'd used when she told Harold's oncologist she needed him to explain it again slower, because she needed to understand every word. Clayton's jaw shifted. "You don't have a choice. Clayton, I want you to leave." He stood, picked up her coffee mug, and poured it. The scalding liquid hit the counter and sheeted over the edge onto her forearm. She gasped, stepped back. And before the gasp finished, his open palm connected with the side of her face. The crack of it cut through the diner like a bat on bone. Ruth went down. She caught the edge of the counter with her hip slid and hit the floor in a scatter of broken ceramic and pooled coffee. The Delacroix sisters were on their feet, but not moving. Hank Pruitt's hand was on his phone, and then it wasn't because Clayton turned and looked at him with those pale, flat eyes, and Hank put the phone back in his pocket. That was the calculus of Clayton Briggs's power. Nobody in this county called anyone. Not on him. He straightened his jacket. Looked down at Ruth, trying to push herself up off the tile, one hand bleeding where the mug had shattered. "Sign the papers," he said. "I'll leave them on the counter." The bell above the door screamed again. Cold air punched through the diner. The kind of cold that carries pine resin and wet granite and elevation. Jack Sullivan stepped inside. He was lean in the way that only came from years of carrying weight over hard ground, not gym lean, work lean. 38 years old, but his eyes sat in his face like a man who'd stopped counting. He wore a Filson coat canvas and oil waxed, and he held the door open just long enough for the dog to come through beside him. The Belgian Malinois was 72 pounds of coiled precision. Dark muzzle, amber eyes, a scar running from his left ear to his collar that told its own story. His name was Ranger, and he moved through the world on a frequency most people couldn't hear. He did not bark. He went still. The stillness of Ranger was a different thing than ordinary stillness. It was the stillness of a tripwire pulled taut. His nose dropped 2 inches, and his nostrils worked in rapid, silent pulses, processing, cataloging, locking onto something. The boots. Ranger moved toward Clayton, with his body low, his ears flat, his tail straight out behind him. Not aggressive. Precise. He stopped 8 inches from the mud-caked boots and held there, unblinking, breathing the air around them in long, controlled draws. Then he shifted into a posture that Jack recognized in his marrow, the passive alert. Not the bark and bite signal of a patrol dog. This was the signal they'd trained into him at the Naval Special Warfare Compound in Coronado. The signal that meant detected chemical compound, high probability of hazard. Ranger sat back on his haunches, pressed his left shoulder against Jack's shin, and stared straight up at Clayton Briggs without making a sound. Jack looked at the boots, at the mud, then up at Clayton. He didn't speak either. Something passed across Clayton's face that wasn't quite fear. Clayton Briggs had not experienced actual fear since his father put him in a headlock at age 9 and told him weakness was a congenital disease. But this was close. The veteran standing at the door had eyes that didn't blink on the right schedule, and that dog was looking at him the way nothing had ever looked at him before, like it already knew. Clayton picked up the manila envelope and walked out. The bell above the door made its sound. The rain closed behind him. Jack crossed to the counter and knelt beside Ruth Miller. She was sitting up now, her palm flat on the tile, blood ribboning between 2 fingers. Her cheek was already beginning to swell into something purple and wrong. He put a hand on her shoulder. Steady. The way you stabilized someone in the field before you moved them. His other hand was shaking. The smell from Clayton's boots was still in the room. Sharp chemical buried inside the mud, an odor Jack knew from a drainage ditch in Helmand Province in 2019, 3 days before his entire team stopped breathing. His chest tightened. The diner's linoleum began to shift at the edges of his vision, the fluorescent light above the counter flickering into the color of a different light in a different country. He pressed his thumb hard into his palm, counted backward from 5. Came back. Ranger leaned against his knee and didn't move. Jack looked at the door where Clayton had been standing, then down at his dog. Whatever was on those boots hadn't come from any logging site. Ruth Miller's farmhouse sat 3 miles up Crooked Creek Road, back from the highway, behind a stand of old-growth Douglas fir that Harold had refused to sell, even when the timber offers were good. Jack drove her in his truck, Ranger riding between them, on the bench seat, the dog's warm weight pressed against Ruth's side like he understood she needed it. She held a dish towel against her cheek and didn't cry. Jack respected that. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "Harold died in March," she said. "They called it organ failure. Multi-system." She paused. "He was 71, but he was healthy. I kept telling Dr. Reeves that. Healthy men don't just fail." Jack kept his eyes on the road. "He drank from the creek his whole life," she said. "We both did." He helped her inside, got ice wrapped in a second dish towel for her face, and sat across from her at the kitchen table while she told him the rest. Clayton had been pressuring Harold for 2 years before the illness started. The county had quietly rezoned 3 parcels east of the lake. The previous spring, rezoned for industrial use, no public hearing, no notice in the Gazette. 2 other families on Crooked Creek had sold. One of them, the Vasquez family, had a teenage son who'd been diagnosed with a kidney disorder 6 months ago. The county health office said it was genetic. Jack sat with that for a moment. "You have well water or creek-fed?" he asked. "Creek-fed, always has been." He looked at Ranger. The dog was sitting at the back door nose, working the gap at the bottom of the frame, reading the outside air. "Lock your doors tonight," Jack said. "Don't answer for anyone except me." She grabbed his wrist before he stood. Her grip was stronger than he expected. "Don't you get killed over my creek," she said. He didn't make her a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The rain had settled into the kind of steady, windless pour that reduced visibility to 30 feet and turned the forest floor into a silent carpet. Good cover. Jack had worked in worse. He went over the fence line east of Ruth's property at 11:20 p.m. Ranger moving beside him off-leashed the dog, reading the ground, the way Jack read a topo map, constantly automatically, every step a calculation. The Briggs industrial land began past the second ridgeline. The county rezoning maps showed it as timber management and processing infrastructure. What that meant on paper and what it meant on the ground were two different things, and Jack had spent enough years in places where official paperwork was fiction to know the difference. Ranger found the first drum 20 minutes in. He sat down beside it in the dark and looked back at Jack. That same silent signal. Hazard. Don't touch. Jack crouched and used the flashlight on its lowest setting, shielding it with his body. The drum was black steel, unmarked, half buried in a trench dug back into the hillside. The ground around it was discolored, not mud dark, but a grayish mineral-stained earth that didn't grow anything. No ferns. No moss. Just dead gray dirt in a 2-foot radius around each drum. He moved along the trench line. There were more. He counted to 40 before he stopped counting and started filming. The phone went to a secure cloud folder, not local storage. 12 minutes of footage. Wide shots for context, close shots for the discoloration, GPS, coordinates embedded in every frame. Jack had done evidence collection in environments where the only court that mattered was operational. And he treated this the same way, thorough, systematic, nothing left to interpretation. Ranger stopped. Jack went flat against a drum before the thought finished forming. The dog's ears were up and rotating forward left. Not a scent alert, a sound alert. Something moving through the tree line at the upper ridge working downhill toward them. Jack killed the flashlight. Checked the wind. It was coming from above, carrying their scent uphill, which meant whoever was above hadn't smelled them yet. He calculated the distance by the sound of snapping underbrush. 60 yards, multiple contacts moving without lights, which meant they knew the terrain. He put his hand flat on Ranger's back. The dog dropped immediately to his belly and went still. Jack pressed himself behind the widest drum in the trench and waited. The footsteps stopped. Then 30 yards to his left, a floodlight detonated. The entire hillside went white. Not one light, a bank of them, motion-triggered, industrial-grade, bolted to steel posts along the ridgeline. In the sudden glare, Jack saw the perimeter clearly for the first time, chain link topped with razor-wire cameras on 20-foot poles and moving between the tree shadows, the shapes of men with rifles held at low ready. Not security guards. The way they moved said something different. Private military. Something. They spread in a textbook flanking pattern, and behind them the distant frantic baying of dogs punched through the rain. Working dogs. Following a scent trail. Their scent trail. Jack looked at Ranger. The dog was already on his feet waiting. 40 acres of dark timber. One exit route. 10 armed men closing it. He'd been in tighter geometry. He moved. Jack moved through the dark the way water moves downhill, not fighting the terrain, using it. He kept the ridgeline to his left, and the creek sound to his right, orienting by acoustics, the way he'd done in valleys where GPS was jammed and maps were wrong. Ranger ran 3 steps ahead, ghosting between the fir trunks, checking back every 15 seconds. They'd done this before. Not here, not in Oregon rain, but the geometry was the same, 2 bodies trying to get small inside a closing perimeter. He put 400 yards between himself and the floodlights, before the dogs behind him found the entry point in the fence. The baying sharpened. They had the scent clean now. Jack didn't run. Running burned oxygen and made noise and narrowed your thinking to a single desperate channel. He moved fast and controlled stepping on root systems instead of mud, using the creek noise to cover sound, his mind 3 moves ahead of his body. The PTSD didn't announce itself. It never did. One moment, he was calculating angles and exit vectors. The next, the rain on his face was the wrong rain, and the tree shapes in his peripheral vision were the wrong shapes. And somewhere underneath the Oregon night, the ground became a different ground, entirely pale dust. Dry, lit by a burning vehicle. In a wadi outside Coast and his team lead. Marcus was saying something into the radio that Jack couldn't make out over the ringing, and the chemical smell was everywhere. He stopped walking. His back hit a tree trunk, and he slid down it without meaning to. One knee in the mud. Rifle, no. No rifle, just his hands pressing flat against wet bark while his lungs forgot the rhythm. 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Ranger came back. The dog didn't whine, didn't paw at him. He simply walked into Jack's chest and stood there, 72 pounds of warm, present alive weight pressing against him until Jack's hands found the dog's ribcage and felt it expanding and contracting, steady, steady, steady. Jack counted the breaths, came back. He was on his feet in 12 seconds and moving again. Behind him, the dogs were getting louder. He almost made the eastern fence line. The shot came from above and to the right from a shooter positioned in the upper branches of a Sitka spruce, which was a patient professional choice that Jack would have respected under different circumstances. He heard the suppressed crack, felt the air displacement, and threw himself left. He wasn't fast enough. The round clipped his left shoulder, spun him, put him face first into the mud. Not a direct hit. Enough. He got up, kept moving. Ranger was beside him. Then Ranger wasn't. The second shot was meant for Jack's center mass. The shooter had reacquired, adjusted for the stumble, and fired on the exhale the way a trained marksman does. Ranger came off the ground from Jack's left side in one continuous motion, not a leap more, like a decision made so fast it looked like instinct, which was the same thing. He hit Jack's shoulder at the moment of the shot, and the round took him instead, catching him along the left side of his chest and spinning him into the ground. The sound Ranger made was small, a single compressed exhale, then nothing. Jack dropped beside him before the echo of the shot finished traveling. No. The word came out as a breath. Then no, no, no. Ranger was on his side in the mud, his chest moving in shallow, rapid pulls. His amber eyes were open and finding Jack's face with that same absolute focus they always had, that unswerving, uncomplicated attention that had pulled Jack back from the dark more times than he'd ever admitted to any therapist or chaplain or VA counselor. The wound was serious. Jack could see that. He pressed both palms against Ranger's side, and the dog didn't flinch, just kept watching him. "Stay," Jack said, which was the only command Ranger had never needed to be taught. The pursuit team was close now. He could hear radios crackling, boots on wet ground. They'd have his position from the muzzle sound alone within 30 seconds. Jack looked at his dog, at the blood on his hands, at the dark tree canopy above them, where rain fell straight down through the branches in thin silver lines. Something that had been tightly wound inside him for 4 years, wound so tight it had become structural, a load-bearing tension he'd organized his entire diminished civilian life around, released. Not snapped. Released. Quietly. Like a decision. He reached into the collar of his shirt and found the device by feel. A GPRS beacon, no bigger than a matchbook encrypted frequency, linked to a number at a building in Coronado, that picked up on the second ring regardless of hour. He pressed the activation sequence, 3 presses, 2-second hold, and felt it transmit. Then he set it down carefully in the mud beside Ranger. He stood up. He turned to face the direction the shots had come from, and he walked out of the shadows toward the lights. The first man came at him fast, confident the way men get when they outnumber their target 8-1 and the target is walking toward them with empty hands. Jack let him close the distance. What happened next lasted 4 seconds, and the man spent 3 of them wondering what had gone wrong. Jack used his momentum, his own body weight, the angle of the muddy slope, and a technique that had no formal name but which a master chief in Coronado had drilled into him until it lived below conscious thought. The man went down hard into the mud and did not get up again, and Jack already had his radio and was moving toward the tree line before the second man could process what he'd seen. He didn't want their weapons. A man with a weapon becomes a man trying to use a weapon, and that changes the geometry. What he wanted was their communication, their positions, and their fear. The radio gave him all 3. He listened for 90 seconds, moving parallel to their search pattern, and mapped the entire deployment by voice alone. 8 men on the ground, 2 holding the fence line, 1 in the spruce, likely reloading or repositioning. Clayton Briggs himself was somewhere near the drum trench. He could hear the man's voice cutting through the static, high-pressured, issuing orders to people who were becoming progressively less willing to follow them. Jack worked from the outside in. The forest did half his work for him. Old-growth fir and hemlock with root systems that made the ground uneven and unpredictable in the dark drainage gullies that cut without warning, nurse logs spanning low ground that looked solid and weren't. He knew the terrain better than they did because he'd walked it coming in, cataloged it the way he cataloged everything automatically, without deciding to. He moved through the outer positions methodically. No noise. No escalation beyond what was necessary to put each man on the ground and keep him there. He used zip ties from his jacket pocket. He carried them the way other people carried keys, and he left each man secured to whatever was anchored and close. The PTSD did not come back. He understood why on some level he couldn't have articulated to a therapist. In the field, there was no gap between thought and action, no space where memory could flood in and drown the present. This was the terrible irony of his condition. The thing that had broken him was also the only environment where he felt completely whole. He didn't examine that. He filed it and moved on. By the time he reached the trench, 4 men were zip-tied to trees, and 2 had made independent decisions to be somewhere else entirely. The shooter from the spruce had come down and walked directly into a root snare Jack had rigged across the only logical descent path, and was now sitting against the tree base with his hands secured above his head, looking at the dark with the expression of a man revising his career choices. Clayton Briggs was standing beside the drums with a flashlight and a phone, trying to reach Boyd on the radio and getting static. Jack stepped out of the tree line into the edge of Clayton's flashlight beam. Clayton swung the light at him, took a step back. His boot heel caught the edge of the trench, and he went down on one knee in the gray dead earth. Jack crossed the distance before Clayton recovered his footing, took him by the jacket collar, and put him face down against the slope beside the nearest drum. Not violent. Controlled. The way you secure something you want to stay put. He pressed Clayton's face 6 inches from the discolored soil. "Look at it," Jack said. Clayton said something that wasn't an answer. "The gray dirt," Jack said. "Look at it. That's what leaching industrial solvent does to topsoil over 14 months. Everything in that ground is in Crooked Creek. Everything in Crooked Creek is in Ruth Miller's water table." He paused. "It was in Harold Miller's water table for 2 years before his kidneys gave out." Clayton stopped talking. "I have 12 minutes of footage on a secure server that's not on any device you can find," Jack said. "GPS tagged, time-stamped with your fence line and your access road in the frame." The rain came down. Jack stood keeping one hand on Clayton's collar, and that was when the tree line on the access road lit up red and blue. A single cruiser. Sheriff's Department. It pulled to the edge of the clearing and sat there with its lights running, engine idling. The door opened, and Sheriff Roy Boyd stepped out in his rain gear, one hand resting on his holster, moving toward them with the unhurried pace of a man who believed the situation was already resolved. He looked at Clayton on the ground, looked at Jack. Then he drew his weapon and pointed it at Jack's head. The smile he produced was the kind that had nothing warm in it. "Son," Boyd said, "you just made the worst mistake of your life. PTSD vet, trespassing, assaulting private security." He shook his head slowly. "Jury in this county'll have you committed before lunch." Jack looked at him. He did not move his hands, did not change his expression. He simply waited. Boyd held the gun steady. Career lawman, 23 years on the job, and his hand did not shake. Jack gave him that much. "Radio your deputy," Boyd said. "Tell him we have a situation on the Briggs tract. Trespasser in custody." He wasn't talking to Jack. He was talking to the empty air, rehearsing the narrative, testing the weight of it. Clayton was already getting to his feet, brushing mud from his jacket, with the automatic dignity of a man who believed the natural order had been restored. "Told you Boyd would sort it," Clayton said. Jack looked at Boyd's face. Not at the gun, the face. The eyes, specifically. He'd spent enough time in rooms with men holding weapons to read the difference between a man who was afraid and a man who had made his calculation and was now simply executing it. Boyd had made his calculation. The gun wasn't a warning. It was a period at the end of a sentence he'd already written. 14 months, Jack said. Boyd's eyes tightened slightly. "That's how long you've known about those drums," Jack said. "County rezoning went through April of last year. You signed off on the variance request. I'm guessing the number was somewhere north of 400,000, wired in 3 installments to a routing number in the Caymans, because that's the structure men like Clayton use when they want the paper trail to end somewhere warm and uncooperative." Boyd's jaw set. "Shut your mouth. Harold Miller was dead by March," Jack said. "You went to the funeral, stood next to Ruth at the graveside, told her Harold was a good man." Something moved across Boyd's face. Not guilt. Guilt had a softness to it. This was the specific discomfort of a man hearing the correct version of a story he'd spent months replacing with a different one. "Last chance to think this through," Boyd said. Jack said nothing. Boyd's finger moved to the trigger. The red dot appeared on Boyd's chest so quietly that for a half second, Boyd didn't understand what he was looking at. He glanced down. Then a second dot materialized 2 inches above the first. Then a third off to the left, climbing toward his throat. 3 separate sources. 3 separate elevations. Boyd turned his head slowly and looked at the tree line. The darkness there was absolute and total, and it looked back at him without blinking. His gun hand dropped 4 inches without him deciding to drop it. The sound came next, rotors still distant, but closing fast, dropping in altitude in the way that military aircraft do when they are not sightseeing but arriving. The frequency of it was wrong for a news helicopter, and wrong for medevac. It was the low, aggressive chop of something large and purposeful eating the distance between itself and a set of GPS coordinates. Clayton heard it and looked up. Boyd heard it and went pale. The Black Hawk came over the eastern ridgeline, with its navigation lights off and its spotlight off, and for 3 seconds, it was simply a sound and a shape occluding the rain clouds. Then the spotlight hit and turned the clearing into noon. The second helicopter was already over the access road. The fast rope dropped before the aircraft finished flaring, and the men coming down it moved the way Jack's team had moved in a dozen insertion points across 3 continents, fast, certain pre-assigned to their objectives before their boots touched ground. They wore tactical gear with no insignia visible in the rain, but 2 of the trailing figures wore FBI windbreakers and carried credentials, and one of them was already on a phone reading a federal warrant number into it as she crossed the clearing. Boyd stood with 3 laser sights on his chest and 4 federal agents inside 10 feet, and his weapon still loosely in his hand, and he looked like a man watching the scaffolding of his entire life disassemble in real time. "Roy Boyd," the lead FBI agent said, "you are under arrest on federal charges, including conspiracy, environmental crimes resulting in death, obstruction, and bribery of a public official." She didn't rush it. Every word landed clean. "Drop the weapon and put your hands where I can see them." Boyd set the gun down in the mud. He looked at Jack once. The expression on his face was not rage. It was something smaller and sadder than rage, the look of a man who had told himself for 14 months that he was managing a situation, and who understood only now that the situation had been managing him. 2 agents walked Clayton to the armored vehicle that had come up the access road behind the cruiser. He said the words lawyer and defamation and civil suit, and the agents listened to all of it with the patient, professional inattention of people who had heard better. Jack did not watch them load up. He was already moving back through the tree line, back the way he'd come, retracing the route to the place where he'd left the beacon in the mud beside his dog. Ranger was where he'd left him, still on his side. His breathing was shallow and far apart now, each inhale a small labor, his amber eyes half closed against the rain. Jack dropped to his knees in the mud. "Hey," he said. Just that word. The way you'd speak to someone you'd known your entire life. Ranger's tail moved once. Barely. But it moved. Jack gathered him up as carefully as he knew how, stood with the dog's full weight against his chest, and turned toward the lights. "Medic," he said to no one and everyone. "I need a medic right now." His voice cracked on the last word. He didn't try to stop it. The veterinary surgical team out of the Naval Special Warfare Support Unit in Bremerton arrived by ground transport at 3:40 a.m. 2 surgeons, 1 anesthesiologist, a trauma tech, who'd worked military working dogs in Kandahar and Mosul and knew exactly what she was looking at when they laid Ranger on the table. Jack sat in the hallway outside the surgical bay on a plastic chair that was too small for him. His shoulder had been wrapped by a federal medic. Someone had given him a cup of coffee that he held without drinking. The fluorescent light above him buzzed at a frequency that should have been annoying, and wasn't because he was somewhere below the level where annoyance registers. He sat there for 4 hours and 11 minutes. He knew the exact number because he watched every one of them pass on the clock, mounted above the supply room door, across the hall. And counting was the only thing that kept the silence from becoming the wrong kind of silence, the kind that had a waddy in it, and burning fuel and the specific weight of absence. At 7:51 a.m., the trauma tech came through the door. She was still in her surgical scrubs, and her expression was the careful, neutral expression of someone who had learned to deliver information without coloring it. Jack stood up before she reached him. She said, "He's stable." Jack sat back down. He put his face in his hands and stayed there for a long moment, and the trauma tech, to her considerable credit, simply stood beside him and said nothing until he was ready. "He's going to need 6 weeks of restricted movement," she said. "The round cracked 2 ribs and nicked the pleural lining. We repaired it. His lung reinflated clean." She paused. "He's a strong dog." "Yeah," Jack said. "He is." The federal case moved with the speed that cases move when the evidence is 12 minutes of GPS-tagged video, 47 barrels of documented industrial solvent, a money trail that took forensic accountants 9 days to fully map, and 2 defendants who immediately began blaming each other in separate holding facilities. Clayton Briggs was indicted on 19 counts, including illegal dumping of hazardous materials, conspiracy, and negligent homicide in connection with Harold Miller's death. His legal team was expensive and loud, and ultimately irrelevant. The EPA regional director flew in from Seattle and held a press conference on the steps of the Oak Haven County Courthouse. The governor's office issued a statement. Boyd took a plea. 12 counts. Federal sentencing guidelines left his attorney very little room to work with, and the judge, a 68-year-old woman from Eugene who had grown up near a Superfund site, appeared to find the room anyway and then declined to use it. Briggs Industrial's operating licenses were suspended, pending full environmental remediation. The cost of that remediation, projected at $23 million over 4 years, was attached as a lien to every asset Clayton Briggs owned in 3 states. The Vasquez family's son started treatment at OHSU in Portland, covered by a victim compensation fund that the federal settlement required Clayton to establish within 90 days. Ruth Miller did not attend any of the proceedings. She reopened the diner. 31 days after the surgery, Jack drove back to Oak Haven on a Tuesday morning, when the rain had finally stopped, and the Cascades were visible for the first time in weeks, white-capped and enormous against a sky the color of good denim. Ranger rode in the passenger seat. He wore a broad wrap of white surgical bandaging around his chest that he had accepted with the dignified resignation of a dog who understood it was non-negotiable. He sat upright and watched the road with his usual attention, cataloging the world through the window as they descended into the valley. The Oak Haven diner had new paint on the exterior. Someone Jack suspected the Delacroix sisters had organized it, had done the trim in a deep green that matched the fir trees behind it. Ruth was behind the counter. She looked up when the bell above the door announced them, and her expression did the thing that faces do when relief and happiness and grief all arrive at the same moment, and the face has to accommodate all three. She came around the counter, and she hugged Jack first, which surprised him, and then she crouched down in front of Ranger and cupped the dog's face in both hands and looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Ranger held very still for this. "You sit down," she told Jack. "Both of you." She brought coffee for Jack, good coffee, the kind she kept behind the counter, for people she'd decided mattered, and then she disappeared into the kitchen. When she came back, she was carrying a white ceramic plate that she set down on the floor near the end of the counter, away from the foot traffic. On the plate, a piece of grilled sirloin, no seasoning, sliced into careful strips, the way you'd cut food for someone you wanted to make sure could eat it comfortably. Ranger looked at it. Looked at Jack. Jack nodded once. The dog lowered himself to the floor with the careful deliberateness of the recently injured and began to eat. His tail moved in slow, steady arcs against the clean linoleum. Jack watched him and felt something in his chest that had been clenched for 4 years open like a hand finally letting go, not healed. He understood enough to know it wasn't that simple, and anyone who told him otherwise was selling something, but different. The weight distributed differently now carried differently, the way an old injury reshapes itself into something you can move with instead of something that stops you. Ruth refilled his coffee without being asked. Outside, the Cascades held their position against the blue sky, patient and enormous, indifferent to everything men did in the valleys below. Inside, a dog ate his breakfast and wagged his tail. It was enough. It was on that Tuesday morning in November in a small diner at the end of a road in Oregon exactly and completely enough. Darkness hides a lot of things. It cannot hide a dog's nose. It cannot hide what loyalty looks like when it stands up and walks toward the fire. If Ranger made you hold your breath tonight, leave a comment below. This story belongs to everyone who's ever been saved by something that couldn't speak but showed up anyway.